Operation David. Operation David was the codename for the deployment of the British Expeditionary Force (BF) into Belgium at the start of the Battle of Belgium during the Second World War. On the same day as the German invasion of neutral Belgium, 10 May 1940, the BEF moved forward from their prepared defences on the Franco-Belgian border to take up a new position deep inside Belgium, conforming to plans made by the French High Command. Forming a defensive line with French and Belgian forces on either side, the BEF were able to contain attacks by German infantry divisions, but were unaware that this was a diversion. The main thrust by highly mobile German armoured divisions was further south. To avoid complete encirclement, the BEF and their allies were forced into a series of fighting retreats and ended up back at their initial border positions by 24 May. However, the German spearhead had reached the coast behind them, cutting them off from their supply chain and leading to the Dunkirk evacuation of the BF in the following days. Planning. In the interwar period, French military planners had adopted the idea of fortifying France's borders, and work on the Maginot Line had started in 1930. In 1932, it had been decided by the Conseil Supérieur de la Guerre that France's northeastern border should not be fortified. The low-lying land made building suitable structures technically difficult, and France had been in a military alliance with Belgium since 1920. Therefore, it was decided that France could best be protected against any German aggression in the region by defending Belgium. This had the advantage that any fighting would not be on French soil, thus preserving the important industrial towns in the border area. This strategy received a setback in 1936 when Belgium declared neutrality and abandoned its military alliance with France, meaning that in the event of a German invasion, the two armies could no longer coordinate their defense plans. The French planners had identified three possible defensive lines inside Belgium. The most obvious was along the Albert Canal, which ran inside the Belgian border with Germany. However, since the declaration of neutrality, it seemed likely that French forces would only be able to move into Belgium. The second alternative was the line of the River Scheldt, or Escaut in French, which ran through Ghent to Antwerp. Although a formidable natural obstacle, defending the Escaut, an option known as the Escaut Plan or Plan E, would entail abandoning large amounts of Belgian territory to the Germans, including Brussels and other major industrial areas. The final possibility was to form a line along the course of the River Dyle, known as the Dyle Plan or Plan D. Although this would preserve more Belgian assets and was shorter than the Escaut line, the river itself was much smaller and hardly bigger than a stream in places. Furthermore, the Dyle did not extend all the way to the River Meuse to create an unbroken line. To the east of the town of Wavre was a 40 kilometers, 25-mile plain without any natural obstacles known as the Gembloux Gap. On deployment to France in September 1939, the BIF, commanded by General Lord Gort, was incorporated into the French First Army Group, which was responsible for the defense of France along the Belgian and Luxembourg border from the Channel coast to the west end of the Maginot Line. Also in the group were the First Army under General d'Armée Georges Maurice Jean Blanchard and the Ninth Army under General d'Armée André Corap. All these forces were under the overall command of the Commander-in-Chief of the Northeast Front, General Georges. The section of the Franco-Belgian border to be held by the BF stretched from Armentières westward towards Menin and then south to where the border met the River Escaut, the French name for the Scheldt at Mauldre, forming a salient around Lille and Roubaix. The British began to fortify their sector with trenches, weapons pits and pillboxes, which became known as the Gort Line. Initially, Maurice Gamelin, the French commander-in-chief of the armies, favored Plan E in advance to the Escaut line, and, in a directive issued on 24 October 1939, he stated that an advance to the Dyle could only be considered if the First Army Group were able to deploy into Belgium before a German attack. Meanwhile, the Belgians had tentatively begun to fortify the Dyle line, known to them as the KW line, which brought about a change in Gamelin's opinion despite opposition from Georges, who was more cautious. On 9 November, a meeting of Allied commanders at Vincennes agreed to the adoption of Plan D and advance to the Dial Line, which was confirmed at a meeting of the Supreme War Council on 17 November. The British were dubious about any advance into Belgium, but given the small size of BF in comparison to the French armies, Gort felt that he had little option but to agree. In January 1940, in the Mechelin incident, a German aircraft carrying their secret invasion plans crash-landed in Belgium. These plans confirmed Gamelin's suspicions that the Germans would attempt a rerun of the 1914 Schlieffen Plan by attacking through Belgium, but also revealed that they were planning to occupy part of the neutral Netherlands, a possibility which Gamelin had previously mooted. Perhaps influenced by this intelligence in March, Gamelin revised Plan D with the Breda variant in which the French 7th Army, under General d'Armée Henry Giraud, would be removed from reserve at Rouen and placed on the border on the left of the BF. In the event of invasion, the 7th Army would race northwards and link up with Netherlands forces at Breda, where it would protect the approaches to Antwerp from falling into German hands. In the final version of the plan, the Belgians were expected to delay a German advance, then retire from the Albert Canal to the Dial from Antwerp to Louvain. On the Belgian right, the BF was to defend about 12 mi 20 km of the Dial from Louvain to Wavre with 9 divisions, and the First Army on the right of the BF was to hold 22 mi 35 km with 10 divisions, from Wavre across the Gembloux Gap to Namur. The Ninth Army would take post south of Namur, along the Meuse to the left northern flank of the Second Army. By March 1940, the BF had doubled in size to 394,165 men since its original deployment. By May 1940, the BF order of battle consisted of 10 infantry divisions in I Corps, Roman II Corps, and Roman III Corps, the BF Air Component Royal Air Force RAF detachment of about 500 aircraft, and the Advanced Air Striking Force OSS Long-Range Bomber Force. These were commanded by General Headquarters GHQ, which held a reserve of headquarters troops, including the 5th Infantry Division, the 1st Army Tank Brigade, and the 1st Light Armored Reconnaissance Brigade, as well as artillery, signals, pioneers, logistic and medical units. Deployment. From 1:00 a.m., the French National Headquarters, Grand Quartier General or GQG, received information from Brussels and Luxembourg that the German invasion was about to begin, and at 4:35 a.m., the German invasion of France and the Low Countries commenced. Gamelin was woken at 6:30 a.m. and ordered the Dial Plan to start. The code word Operation David initiated the British part of the Dial Plan. The British vanguard, spearheaded by the armoured cars of the 12th Royal Lancers, crossed the border at 1 p.m. on 10 May, cheered on by crowds of Belgian civilians who lined their route. The section of the Dial, which had been allocated to the BF, ran from Louvain southwest to Wavre, a distance of some 22 miles 35 kilometers. Gort had decided to man the front line with only 3 divisions, 3rd Division from Roman II Corps in the north with 1st and 2nd Divisions from I Corps further south, leaving some battalions to defend a frontage double that recommended by British Army field manuals. The BF had sufficient motor transport to move the 3 front-line divisions in a movement intended to be completed in 90 hours, nearly 4 days. The remaining BF divisions were positioned so as to provide defense in depth all the way back to the river Escaut. They were required to march towards their objectives until motor transport became available. On arrival at the riverbank, to the north of Louvain, 3rd Division found that part of their allotted position was already occupied by Belgian troops, who refused to move out for their British allies, even though Brooke appealed directly to the King of the Belgians, and finally had to be directly ordered out by Georges. Those British infantry battalions posted along the bank of the Dial began to arrive on 11 May and started to dig trenches. The defences that had previously been constructed by the Belgians amounted to only a few scattered pill boxes and some barbed wire. These preparations were protected by a screen of light tanks and Bren carriers operating on the western side of the river to keep German reconnaissance patrols away. They were withdrawn on 14 May when all the front line units were in place and the bridges were then blown. Defense of the Dial. The first appearance of German forces on the BF front was on the afternoon of 14 May, when reconnaissance troops of 3 German infantry divisions arrived in motor cars or on motorcycles. They were apparently unaware of the British positions, and in several places approached the Dial without taking cover, where they were an easy target for small arms fire and artillery. Later in the evening, parts of the line were fired on by German field guns, the first experience for many British troops of enemy fire. Organized German attacks commenced on 15 May, when attacks on Louvain by the German 19th Infantry Division were repulsed by 3rd Division, commanded by Major General Bernard Montgomery. On the left of the division's line, the 1st Grenadier Guards were forced to abandon their forward positions and withdraw behind the Dial Canal, which ran a short distance to the west of the river, but there the line held. At dawn on the following day, following a 2-hour barrage, a determined attack was made on Louvain railway station and the adjacent goods yard, but after a prolonged fight, the Germans were thrown back in a counter-attack by the 1st Royal Ulster Rifles and the 1st King's Own Scottish Borderers. Further south, the river was only about 15 feet wide, and while it prevented tanks from crossing, it was a less effective barrier to a determined infantry assault. During one such attack at the south of the BF line near Wever, 2nd Lieutenant Richard Annand of the 2nd Durham Light Infantry earned a Victoria Cross by preventing troops of the German 31st Infantry Division from crossing a demolished bridge by repeatedly throwing grenades onto it. All the German bridgeheads across the Dial were either repulsed or effectively contained by British counter-attacks, but by the morning of 16 May, events far to the south had caused Gort to be ordered to withdraw the BF back to the Escaut. Events elsewhere. The French 7th Army drove forward on the northern flank, and advanced elements reached Breddy on 11 May. They found that the Moerdijk Causeway had been captured by German paratroops, cutting the link between southern and northern Holland, and forcing the Dutch army to retire north towards Amsterdam and Rotterdam. The French collided with the 9th Panzer Division, and the advance of the 25e Division d'Infanterie Motor C was stopped by German infantry, tanks and Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers as the Wonner Division Legermechanische was forced to retreat. French heavy tanks were still on trains south of Antwerp. The Breda variant had been forted in fewer than 2 days, and on 12 May Gamelin ordered the 7th Army to cancel the plan and cover Antwerp. The 7th Army retired from the Bergen-op-Zoom Turnhout Canal line 20 mi 32 km from Antwerp to Lier 10 mi 16 km away on 12 May. On 14 May the Dutch surrendered. In Belgium, the Albert Canal defence line was based on the fortress of Eben and Mael, and was broken when German glider troops landed on the roof and captured it by noon on 11 May. 2 bridges over the Maasmeuse were captured at Maastricht. The disaster forced the Belgian army to retreat towards the line from Antwerp to Louvain on 12 May, far too soon for the French First Army to arrive and dig in. The French Corps de Cavalry had reached the Gembloux Gap on 11 May, and officers reported that the area had been far less fortified by the Belgians than expected. Anti-tank defences had not been built, and there were no trenches or concrete fortifications. There were some quintet elements, steel barriers, but none of the anti-tank mines supposed to protect them. Some of the quintet elements were so poorly sited that a French officer asked if the Germans had been asked where to put them. Prieu tried to persuade Bellot and Georges to scrap the Dial plan and revert to the Escaut plan, but with the First Army group moving, Georges decided against changing the plan, but Blanchard was ordered to accelerate the advance of the First Army to arrive a day early on 14 May. On 15 May, the Germans attacked the First Army along the Dial line, causing the meeting engagement that Gamelin had tried to avoid. The First Army repulsed the Roman 16 Panzer Corps, but during the Battle of Gembloux 14-15 May, but GQG realized too late that the attack they were facing was a diversion. The main German attack had come further south, where Army Group B had burst through the lightly defended Ardennes. Withdrawal to the Escaut. On 16 May, the First Army Group was ordered to retreat from the Dial Line to avoid being trapped by the German breakthrough against the 2nd and 9th Armies, but on 20 May the Germans reached Abbeville on the Channel coast, cutting off the northern armies. The plan for the BF withdrawal was that under cover of darkness, units would thin out their front and make a phased and orderly withdrawal before the Germans realized what was happening. The objective for the night of 16/17 May was the Charleroi to Willebroek Canal, known to the BF as the Line of the Seine, the following night to the River Dender from Maubeuge to Termonde and the Escaut to Antwerp the Dender Line, and finally on 18/19 May to the Escaut from Oudenarde to Molde on the French border, the Escaut Line. The order to withdraw was greeted with astonishment and frustration by the British troops, who felt that they had held their own, but they were unaware of the deteriorating situation elsewhere. Fortunately, the BF training had included the complicated task of withdrawal while in contact with the enemy, a maneuver described by military historian Julian Thompson as one of the most difficult phases of war to conduct successfully. Starting at 9 p.m., and under the cover of an intense bombardment by the British artillery, who expended their stockpiled ammunition, the withdrawal went mainly according to plan. On the far left of the British line, the situation was complicated by the early withdrawal of the neighbouring Belgians, allowing the Germans to pass around the flank of 1st Coldstream Guards and occupy the town of Herent, which was on the withdrawal route. Hard fighting, including a bayonet charge, was required to clear the road, at a cost of 120 Guards' casualties. The last units to leave the line were the divisional cavalry regiments in their light tanks and carriers. A later communication breakdown caused a total loss of coordination with the Belgian army to the northwest of Roman II Corps, and a dangerous gap opened up between the two. Fortunately, it was covered by British light armour before the Germans could discover and exploit it. Defence of the Escaut. On the British sector of the Escaut, 7 BF divisions were placed in the front line. They were from the north the 44th, 4th, 3rd, 1st, 42nd, 2nd, and 48th divisions. The British divisions were facing 9 German infantry divisions, who began their attack on the morning of 21 May with a devastating artillery barrage. Rebarrage. Shortly afterwards, infantry assaults started along the whole front, crossing the canalized river either by inflatable boats or by clambering across the wreckage of demolished bridges. Although the Escaut line was penetrated in numerous places, all the German bridgeheads were either thrown back or contained by vigorous but costly British counter-attacks, and the remaining German troops were ordered to retire across the river by the night of 22 May. One such British counter-attack near the village of Esclise was led by Lance Corporal Harry Nichols of 3rd Battalion, Grenadier Guards, who was taken prisoner and later awarded the Victoria Cross. Withdrawal to the Gort Line. In a meeting between Gort and his corps commanders on 22 May, it was agreed that the Escaut line could not be held for long and a withdrawal was planned for the following night, 23/24 May. In the meantime, in a chaotic series of meetings at Ypres, General Maxime Weygand, who had recently taken over from Gamelin, proposed to King Leopold and Blot a new defensive line in which the Belgians would defend the river lies, while on 23/24 May the British would withdraw to their border defences, the Gort Line, which it was hoped would allow. Weygand had hoped that the Belgians would retire to the shorter defensive line of the River Usser, as they had in 1914. However, Leopold was unwilling to abandon so much Belgian soil, and perhaps viewed in retrospect, indicating that he had no intention of fighting a prolonged campaign. Although Gort knew that the meeting was planned, a communication breakdown at his headquarters meant that he knew neither the time or the location, and was finally located by Belgian staff officers. Weygand had left before Gort arrived, believing that Gort had been absent deliberately. In a final meeting, Weygand's plan was agreed without Gort being able to explain the difficulties to him. Follot was fatally injured in a traffic accident on his way back to his headquarters, sowing further confusion. Starting on 17 May, Gort began to improvise formations in an effort to prevent the BF exposed southern flank from Army Group B. These forces used the canal from Gravelines on the coast through St. Omer, Bethune, and La Bassée, known as the Canal Line. Forward of this line, the town of Arras was being held by a determined British garrison, and in order to support them, a modest force led by Gott's only heavy armour, the 1st Army Tank Brigade, attacked south on 21 May. Although the Battle of Arras came as a shock to the Germans, it achieved little in real terms. The withdrawal from the Escaut went smoothly on the southern end of the line, with light armour again providing an effective rearguard. However, in the far north, 44th Division had difficulty contacting all their units. Since there were no radios below battalion levels, and the field telephone lines had been disrupted by heavy shelling and bombing, messages had to be sent by runners or in vehicles, many of which fell victim to enemy fire. For the first time in the campaign, the Germans continued to push forwards at night, and the 44th and neighboring 4th Division had to fight their way out. Aftermath. On 24 May, the BF was back where it had started, but now had the enemy behind them as well as in front, and were cut off from their supplies. Troops had been placed on half rations on the previous day. Additionally, nearly all of the RAF air component had been withdrawn to England, making the provision of air support even more difficult, and moreover much of the air effort had been diverted to support the fighting at Boulogne and Calais. The shorter front and better defences at the frontier allowed Gort to move 2nd and 48th Divisions towards Lille to reinforce the defence of the Canal Line. On 25 May, with the need to evacuate being evident, Brooke's Roman II Corps was ordered to form a defensive line on the Ypres-Comines Canal, in order to create a protected corridor along which the main body of the BF could withdraw towards the coast, the start of the Battle of Dunkirk. The battle honours awarded to participating regiments during Operation David in Belgium include Northwest Europe 1940 Dial, Withdrawal to the Escaut and Defence of Escaut.